Hello everyone on the channel. I've been writing this account for 3 weeks. Not because it's long or complicated, but because reliving this experience still gives me chills. This happened about 2 years ago when I was a sales representative and spent more time on the road than at home. This story has never left my mind, and maybe sharing it here will help me finally move on. It was a typical night in mid-October. I, Andrew Miller, was driving alone toward Denver, Colorado, after a week full of meetings in Omaha, Nebraska. The road was long and deserted, cutting through endless cornfields under the dark sky. I've always enjoyed driving at night when the roads are quieter and everything feels at peace. It was past midnight when I entered an especially isolated stretch of road. There wasn't another car in sight, neither ahead nor behind. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the straight road ahead. A light fog began to form, something I didn't think much of at first. It's common in rural areas during the early hours, but as the minutes passed, the fog grew thicker, almost unnatural, as if it had a will of its own. My high beams barely pierced through the fog. Everything around me seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The sense of calm I usually felt during these nighttime drives vanished. The road felt heavy, oppressive. I turned on the radio to break the silence, but the signal was full of static, and the songs were barely audible. And then I heard it. Whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the cornfields, but it wasn't. These were voices. Low, indistinct, but definitely human. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once. My chest tightened as I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. When I looked in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. For a brief moment, I was sure I saw something, or someone, moving in the fog, at a distance impossible to gauge. A tall, slender shadow stood still in the middle of the road. I blinked, turned to look again, but it was gone. My mind told me to keep driving, but my entire body was frozen with fear. The silence on the road became deafening, except for the whispers that grew louder, as if they were closing in. Then suddenly something hit the roof of the car. It was as if a rock or a branch had fallen from the sky, but there were no trees nearby, just the empty road and the endless cornfields. I stepped on the gas. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest, and the whispers were now inside my head, impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a peaceful drive. Something was following me on that road, something I couldn't understand, but it seemed determined to make me stop. And then I saw it again, right ahead of me, standing in the middle of the road. A figure, tall, thin, with arms that seemed unnaturally long. It had no face, or, if it did, it was obscured by the fog. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just a few meters away from the figure. But when I looked again, it was gone. There was nothing there. Just the oppressive emptiness of the road and the fog surrounding me. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I had no idea what else awaited me down that road. After that terrifying experience on the silent road, Mark felt like something had fundamentally changed within him. The following days were consumed by a mix of paranoia and an uncontrollable curiosity. He couldn't shake the image of the man's eyes, the motionless shadow, and the distant laughter that seemed to echo endlessly in his head. Mark decided he had to go back. It might have been a terrible idea, but he knew he couldn't move on without trying to understand what had happened that night. He reviewed the map of the area and devised a plan. He'd return to the road during daylight, armed with a powerful flashlight, a camera, and his trusty baseball bat. On Saturday morning, he drove to the road's entrance. Daylight didn't make the place any less eerie. The trees were still dense, casting a perpetual shadow over the cracked asphalt. Mark parked his car in a small pull-off and began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the silence around him was deafening. A few meters in, he spotted the tire marks from his previous visit and the remnants of the beer can he had discarded days ago. But something else was there. A small notebook with a dirty, torn cover lay right in the middle of the road. He didn't remember leaving it there. Reluctantly, Mark picked up the notebook. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, each one covered in scribbled words and grotesque drawings. The sentences seemed like desperate warnings. They are always here. Don't leave the car. What you saw, they saw too. A chill ran down Mark's spine. The drawings depicted human-like figures with elongated faces and hollow eyes, standing in the road, surrounding vehicles. On one page, there was a sketch that felt disturbingly familiar. His car, with a figure standing exactly where he had seen the man that night. A sound broke the silence behind him like a twig snapping. He spun around, gripping the baseball bat tightly. Nothing. Just the empty road. The wind began to pick up, but there was no sound of rustling leaves, only the same oppressive silence. Suddenly, a familiar smell hit him. The same metallic odor he had sensed in the car that night. Mark scanned his surroundings and his flashlight began to flicker for no apparent reason. At the far end of the road, the shadow reappeared, only this time it was much closer. The figure moved slowly, but Mark didn't wait to see what would happen. He dropped the notebook, turned, and sprinted back to his car. The trees seemed to close in around him, branches snapping as though something was moving quickly through the woods. When he finally reached his car, he jumped in and locked the doors with trembling hands. As he started the engine, the car radio, off just moments ago, turned on by itself. A raspy, almost inaudible voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Mark floored the accelerator, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually he reached the exit. As he merged onto a main highway, the absolute silence was replaced by the familiar sounds of civilization, but the terror inside him lingered. Back home, Mark tried to forget, but things were never the same. Lights would flicker at night, and he swore he could hear footsteps in the hallway. The notebook, which he had left on the road, mysteriously appeared on his desk days later, open to the page that read, "What you saw, they saw too." Mark sold his car and moved to another state, but nothing seemed to rid him of the feeling that he was being watched. The silent road was never visited again, but for Mark, what he encountered there would follow him forever. 2 months ago, my friend Tyler invited me to go camping in Whistler Forest, Washington. Tyler had always been fascinated by outdoor adventures, and even though it wasn't really my thing, I decided to accept. It was a chance to disconnect from routine and enjoy nature. We arrived on Friday afternoon, and the forest was even more impressive than I had imagined. Towering trees formed a natural canopy, blocking out most of the sunlight. The trail to our campsite was well marked, but the place had a dense, heavy silence that was almost intimidating. After about an hour of hiking, we found a clearing near a stream. It was the perfect spot to set up our tents and build a fire. While we were setting up camp, Tyler, excited as always, brought up stories about people disappearing and urban legends surrounding the forest. I pretended not to care, but deep down, those stories unsettled me. Around late afternoon, Tyler suggested exploring more of the trail before it got dark, but I decided to stay behind and organize our gear. He went off alone, promising not to take too long. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and the forest's silence was almost deafening. When Tyler returned, it was already dark. He seemed excited and told me he'd found an abandoned cabin further up the trail. According to him, it was in ruins, but there were furniture and objects inside, as if someone had been living there recently. I suggested we check it out in the morning, but he insisted on going at night, saying it would be more thrilling. I grabbed my flashlight and we headed down the trail. Tyler led the way while I illuminated our path. The forest felt more alive at night, but not in a comforting way. There was something in the air, a sense that we weren't alone. The sound of leaves and twigs snapping seemed to come from all directions, as if something or someone was following us. After about 15 minutes, we reached the cabin. It was an old structure with rotting wooden planks and shattered windows. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Tyler entered first, while I hesitated outside. When I finally mustered the courage to go in, I was hit by a strong smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place. Inside, there was an old table covered in yellowed papers, a torn-up sofa in the corner, and strange marks on the walls like deep scratches. Tyler found a dusty notebook on the table and started flipping through it. The pages were filled with drawings and incoherent notes, as if someone had written them in a state of desperation. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise outside, like something had fallen or been thrown against the cabin. Tyler looked at me, and for the first time that night I saw fear in his eyes. We ran toward the door, but before we could open it, another sound came from inside, this time from upstairs. My flashlight started flickering, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. Tyler grabbed my arm and whispered, "I think someone's here." And that's when we heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps above us coming down the stairs. The footsteps descending the cabin stairs were slow and deliberate, almost as if whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was coming. Tyler's grip on my arm was so tight I could barely move. My flashlight kept flickering, its intermittent beams of light only making the atmosphere more terrifying. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, barely able to contain my panic. He nodded, and together we bolted for the cabin door. But when we pushed it, we realized it was jammed or blocked by something. Tyler began pounding on the wood, shouting for it to open, while I desperately tried to keep the flashlight steady to illuminate the room. It wasn't working. The footsteps drew closer. I could hear the creaking of the wooden stairs under the weight of whatever was approaching. My heart was pounding, every second stretching into an eternity. When I finally glanced at the stairs, I froze. A silhouette stood on the middle step, completely still, just watching us. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't respond. Then, slowly, it began descending again, revealing faint traces of a face shrouded in shadow. There was something deeply wrong about how it moved, almost inhuman. Without hesitation, Tyler grabbed a piece of wood from the floor, wielding it like a makeshift weapon. "Stay away from us!" he shouted, his voice trembling with fear. The figure stopped on the last step, fully visible now. It was a tall man in tattered, dirt-stained clothes. His face was marked with deep scars, and his eyes, they were utterly void, as though there was no life behind them. He didn't say a word. He simply pointed at the notebook in Tyler's hand. Realizing what the man wanted, Tyler threw the notebook onto the floor, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at us, as if waiting for something. Then a deafening noise filled the cabin, a scream, but twisted and inhuman. That was all the motivation we needed. Together, we slammed against the door with all our strength, breaking it open and sprinting down the trail. We didn't look back, only focused on running as fast as we could, but behind us we could hear heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, pursuing us. When we finally reached our campsite, the dying embers of the fire barely lit the clearing. We grabbed our belongings hastily, stuffing everything into our backpacks. But as I worked, I noticed Tyler had gone still, his eyes fixed on the trees. "He's there," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw the silhouette again, standing among the trees, unmoving, just watching us. This time, however, it didn't follow as we bolted down the trail toward our car. Once inside the vehicle, Tyler floored the gas pedal, and we sped away without looking back. The silence in the car was suffocating. Neither of us wanted to talk about what had just happened, at least not yet. When we finally got home, Tyler swore he would never set foot in Whistler Forest again. I didn't need convincing. A few days later, Tyler called me to say he had burned the notebook he had brought back from the cabin. He didn't explain why, but there was something in his voice, an edge of fear, that told me he didn't want to take any chances with whatever had been inside that cabin. Even now, when I think of Whistler Forest, a chill runs down my spine. I don't know who or what that man was, but I'm certain of one thing. He was waiting for us, and somehow we barely escaped. Hello everyone on the channel. I've been replaying this story in my head for days, and just thinking about it still gives me chills. It was an ordinary night, the kind that starts without any sign of what's to come. I had left work a bit later than usual and decided to stop at a 24-hour service station to refuel and grab something to eat before heading home. The road was deserted. That familiar feeling of solitude on an open road usually didn't bother me, but that night, it felt different. Heavy in a way I couldn't explain. When I saw the lights of the service station in the distance, it felt like finding an oasis in the desert. I parked my car in front of one of the pumps, got out, and began refueling. The air was cold, and the only sound was the steady click of the fuel filling the tank. I hadn't noticed the figure in the background standing near the illuminated convenience store sign until I felt the weight of his gaze on me. It was a man. He stood on the sidewalk wearing a black hat that cast shadows over his face, even under the fluorescent lights. He didn't move, just stood there watching me, as if studying my every move. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself that he was probably just another traveler waiting for someone or taking a break. After finishing at the pump, I went into the store to grab a coffee and a snack. The space was small, with cramped shelves and a young cashier who seemed more interested in his phone than in the customers. As I browsed for something to eat, a shiver ran down my spine. I glanced toward the door, and there he was, the man in the hat, standing in the corner, pretending to browse the shelves. I tried to act naturally, but the unease was impossible to shake. His movements were slow, almost calculated, and he kept just enough distance to feel unsettling. I grabbed my coffee and went to the register, where the cashier finally looked up from his phone to ring me up. "Quiet night, huh?" I said, trying to make small talk and shake off the tension. "Yeah, too quiet, actually," he replied disinterestedly, but his eyes flicked discreetly toward the man in the hat. I paid quickly and left the store, but as I reached my car, I realized the man had also left. He was standing on the other side of the parking lot, still watching me. The weight of fear started to press down on me. I got into my car and locked the doors, but before starting the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was no longer standing in the same spot. He had vanished. Suddenly, I heard the sound of metal against glass, a faint tapping, but enough to make me freeze. Slowly, I turned my head and saw him. He was standing outside my car, just inches from the passenger side window, his hat still obscuring part of his face. But his smile, that was unmistakable. Without thinking twice, I started the car and sped off as fast as I could. As I raced down the deserted road, I couldn't stop myself from glancing in the rearview mirror, fearing that he might be following me. After a few miles, I began to calm down, convinced that I had left that unnerving figure behind. But the real terror was still to come. Driving down the deserted road, I tried to control my breathing and keep my eyes on the path ahead. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, even after leaving the service station behind. I checked the rearview mirror multiple times, praying not to see anyone following me, but paranoia had already gripped me. My car's headlights illuminated only the asphalt and the trees lining the road. The silence was broken solely by the hum of the engine and the wind whistling against the windows. All I wanted was to get home, lock myself in my room, and forget that disturbing encounter. That's when I noticed something strange on the dashboard. The fuel gauge, which should have been full after refueling, was dropping rapidly. It didn't make sense. Cold sweat dripped down my neck. Had something happened at the station? Had he tampered with my car while I was in the store? The road seemed endless, but in the distance I spotted the faint lights of a rest area. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop. My heart pounded, and the last thing I wanted was to get out of the car, but I couldn't keep driving with the gas disappearing like that. I parked near a flickering streetlight that seemed ready to go out. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out, trying to ignore the fact that I was alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded only by darkness. I walked to the gas tank, kneeling to check for leaks. While inspecting the car, I heard a noise from the forest beside the rest area. It was the snapping of branches, like someone walking through the trees. I stood up quickly, looking toward the sound, but saw nothing except the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. I got back into the car and shut the door, but before starting the engine, something caught my eye. In the side mirror's reflection, I saw movement. A figure appeared on the road, walking calmly toward me. It was him, the man with the hat. For a few seconds, my body froze as I watched him approach. He wasn't running, just walking, as if he had all the time in the world. His hands were in the pockets of his long coat, and his hat still obscured part of his face, but I could feel the same unsettling smile as before. I started the engine and sped away as fast as I could. The sense of relief didn't last long. After a few minutes on the road, I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw something that made my stomach drop. He was there, sitting in the back seat, hat on his head, and that chilling smile on his face. "You're a good driver," he said in a low, almost soothing voice. I screamed and swerved the car violently, veering off the road and stopping on the shoulder. When I turned around, he was gone. The back seat was empty. My mind was in chaos. Was I imagining things? Had exhaustion and fear pushed me to the point of hallucinating? But that smile, it was unforgettable. I got back on the road, driving carefully, but the dread of him reappearing kept me on edge the entire time. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat on the couch, clutching my phone with the police's number already dialed, just in case. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep a single second. To this day, I don't know if he was a real threat or a figment of my imagination. But something inside me tells me that wasn't the last time I'd see him. And every time I drive down a deserted road at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, praying that the man with a hat never appears again. Some stories seem to rise from the ground, like roots from an endless field that refuses to stop growing. This is one of them, and no matter how much I try to forget, the sound of the wind rustling through the stalks still echoes in my mind. My name is Ethan, and a year ago I returned to my hometown, a small rural community in Kansas. After a difficult separation and the stress of big city life, spending time tending the farm I'd inherited from my parents seemed like a good idea. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by vast cornfields stretching as far as the eye could see. At first, the routine was almost therapeutic. The smell of the earth, the sound of birds, and the slower pace of rural life helped me find some peace. But things began to change when summer arrived. One night I was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee and gazing at the stars. The quiet of the night was interrupted only by the soft rustling of the corn in the breeze. Then I heard something different, a faint laugh, almost childlike, coming from the field. I stood up, intrigued. Who could be out there at this hour? Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped off the porch and began walking toward the cornfields. As I got closer, the laughter became clearer, accompanied by faint, indistinct whispers. The flashlight illuminated only the narrow path between the towering stalks, but I couldn't see anything beyond the dense vegetation. I called out loudly, "Is someone there?" The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the air even heavier. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, but then something moved to my right. I swung the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing. Just the stalks, swaying gently. I returned to the house with my heart racing, convincing myself it was nothing, perhaps an animal or the wind creating strange sounds. The next morning, as I inspected the field, I noticed something odd. A section of the corn was flattened, as if someone had walked through it, forming a zigzagging path. It wasn't something an animal could do. Stranger still, I found a white handkerchief hanging from one of the stalks, swaying gently. It looked deliberately placed. As the days passed, the noises and laughter became more frequent, always at night, always in the field. I tried to ignore them, but my curiosity eventually got the better of me. One night I grabbed my flashlight, a jacket, and an old machete, determined to investigate. The sky was overcast with no moon or stars to light the way. The sound of the wind through the stalks was louder than ever, almost like a whisper beckoning me into the field. I walked along the same path I'd seen before, the flashlight barely illuminating a few feet ahead. After a few minutes, I saw something in the distance, a small figure standing among the stalks. "Hey, who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for me. As I got closer, I realized it was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with long, unkempt hair and a white dress that looked old and dirty. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound less frightened than I felt. She finally turned to face me. Her face was partially hidden by her hair, but I could see a faint, unsettling smile forming. Before I could say another word, she darted into the corn. Instinctively, I followed, but she was quick, vanishing among the stalks as if she knew every path. I ran for several minutes before realizing I was completely lost. The corn around me seemed to grow taller, closing in like it was swallowing me whole. That's when I heard the laughter again, this time coming from all directions. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. My breathing was ragged and sweat dripped down my face. Then a voice whispered near my ear, "You shouldn't be here." I spun the flashlight around desperately, but there was no one there, just the corn, swaying softly. At that moment, I knew I had to get out as quickly as possible. Not knowing where I was going, I ran blindly through the field, the stalks scratching my face and arms. The laughter continued, growing louder and closer, until I finally saw the lights of the house in the distance. When I reached the safety of the porch, I looked back, expecting to see the girl again. But the field was quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, but the sound of the wind in the corn kept me awake. And the worst part? On the porch railing, there was another white handkerchief. I didn't sleep that night. The white handkerchief left on the porch railing felt like a taunt. Something or someone was watching me, and that thought sent my mind spiraling. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being unsafe. As I sat in the kitchen, staring out at the field, the corn looked like an army of silent sentinels, guarding a secret I was never meant to uncover. The image of the girl and her unnerving smile haunted my every thought. I knew I needed help. I called Tom, a childhood friend who still lived in town. Tom was a skeptic, the type who always sought logical explanations for everything. When I told him what had been happening, he laughed. "Ethan, your mind's playing tricks on you. Those empty fields can be spooky at night. Want me to come by tonight and help you check it out?" Reluctantly, I agreed. I wasn't sure if he believed me or was just trying to humor me, but having someone there felt better than facing it alone. Tom arrived at dusk, carrying a powerful flashlight and a hunting rifle. "Just in case," he said, with a confident grin. As night fell, we decided to head back into the field. The wind was stronger that evening, and the sound of the rustling corn was almost deafening. We walked side by side, shining our flashlights ahead. At first, everything seemed calm, but then, as if the field knew we were there, the whispers started again. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "Probably just the wind," Tom replied, though he didn't sound as sure as he usually did. A little further in, we stumbled upon another path in the corn, similar to the one I'd seen before. It looked as though someone had deliberately carved it out. We followed the trail, and that's when we heard the laughter. Tom froze, his flashlight trained on the source of the sound. In its beam, something darted quickly through the stalks and vanished. "That was a kid?" he asked, now visibly uneasy. Before I could answer, the laughter came again, this time closer, surrounding us. "There's something wrong here, Ethan. We need to leave. I need to know what's going on." Despite his hesitation, Tom followed as we continued down the path. We eventually came to a small clearing in the middle of the field. In the center stood something that made my blood run cold. A scarecrow. But it wasn't like any scarecrow I'd ever seen. It wore a tattered white dress and had a handkerchief tied around its neck. Its face was a burlap sack, with buttons for eyes and a grotesque red thread smile stitched across it. "This has to be some kind of prank," Tom said, clearly uncomfortable. Before I could reply, we heard the sound of fast footsteps behind us. We swung our flashlights around, but no one was there. "Ethan, we need to leave. Now." I nodded, but before we could move, the laughter returned, this time coming from directly behind the scarecrow. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the girl. Her face was hidden beneath her hair, but I'd recognize that white dress anywhere. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly lifted her head, revealing that same distorted smile. Without warning, she broke into a sprint, heading straight for us. Tom fired the rifle, but whether he hit her or not, I couldn't tell. She vanished into the corn again, but the sound of her footsteps and laughter continued to echo all around us. We ran like our lives depended on it, stumbling through the stalks and desperately trying to find our way back to the house. The laughter followed us, growing louder and louder as if the entire field was mocking us. When we finally reached the porch, we were out of breath and on the verge of panic. We slammed the door shut and turned off all the lights, huddling in the dark and trying to calm down. "Ethan, this isn't normal," Tom said, his eyes wide with fear. At that moment, we heard a tapping on the window. It wasn't aggressive, but slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was announcing its presence. Tom shone his flashlight toward the glass, but there was nothing there. Only a white handkerchief tied outside, swaying gently in the wind. The next morning, Tom left quickly, muttering that he'd never set foot on that farm again. I knew he was right. I sold the land and moved to the city as soon as I could. Even now, the sound of wind rustling through cornfields gives me chills. And sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I swear I still hear that laughter in the distance, as if the field is calling me back. It all began with an unexpected message. "My name is Andrew Peterson, and I'm a real estate agent in Salem, Massachusetts. That day, while organizing documents for a house I had just sold, I received an email titled, 'Proposal for Sale, Property on Salem Hill.' I immediately recognized the address, 42 Hillcrest Road. That house. Everyone in town knew the stories about it. Isolated atop a hill surrounded by twisted trees, the mansion had stood vacant for decades. Some said it belonged to a wealthy heiress who mysteriously vanished. Others claimed the house had a darker past, marred by inexplicable tragedies and macabre activities. The email, however, was straightforward. Apparently, the property had passed into the hands of a distant heir who wanted to sell it quickly. The client seemed to value discretion, mentioning that the house needed an evaluation and some photos for the listing. He offered me a generous commission, and since I was in need of a big deal, I agreed without hesitation. 2 days later, on a gray, damp morning, I drove to Salem Hill. The weather seemed to conspire to make the task even more unpleasant. The road leading to the property was covered in dead leaves and fallen branches. My phone's GPS stopped working, but I already knew I was close. The silhouette of the mansion emerged at the hilltop, imposing and grim, with its dusty windows and partially collapsed roof. I parked my car at the rusted gate and grabbed my camera, flashlight, and notepad. As I walked along the overgrown path, I felt a creeping unease as though I was being watched. I glanced around, but all I saw were motionless trees and the overcast sky. I reached the front door, a heavy structure of dark wood with intricate carvings. The key was exactly where the client said it would be, beneath a stone beside the porch. As I turned the key in the lock, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, chilly interior. Surprisingly, the house was well preserved despite its abandonment. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and a thick layer of dust coated the floors. But there was something strange in the air, a faint metallic scent, like blood mixed with rust. I walked through the main hallway, snapping photos and jotting down details. The walls were adorned with old portraits of people who must have lived there. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I tried to focus on my work, ignoring the growing sense of unease. Upstairs, I found a large bedroom with a window overlooking the hill. When I drew the curtains, the faint daylight illuminated the room. It was well furnished with a canopy bed, an old armchair, and a desk cluttered with yellowed papers. But what caught my attention was a large oval mirror in one corner of the room. I was adjusting my camera to take a photo when something strange happened. For a brief moment, I saw movement in the mirror's reflection. Something passed quickly behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. My breathing grew heavy, but I tried to calm myself. Perhaps it was just my imagination. Determined to finish the job quickly, I headed to the basement to inspect the house's structure, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave. The basement was even gloomier than the rest of the house. Each step on the wooden stairs creaked, and the air was dense, almost suffocating. I turned on my flashlight, illuminating an old boiler and some dusty boxes. That's when I noticed something carved into the stone wall, a strange symbol, like a circle surrounded by runes. As I examined it, I heard a noise above me, dragging footsteps. Frozen with fear, I stared at the ceiling. I was alone, wasn't I? Who else could be here? I bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the main hallway, the front door was wide open. I was certain I had closed it when I entered. I left the house, locking the door behind me. But as I got into my car and glanced back at the mansion, I swear I saw a figure standing at the second-floor window. The same bedroom with the mirror. That night I sent the report to the client, vowing never to return. Yet the figure in the window and the symbols in the basement continued to haunt me. I thought I had left the mansion behind. Little did I know, it hadn't left me. After that restless night, I tried to move on. The report was sent, and Mr. Bellamy, the client, responded with thanks, promising to follow up soon to close the sale. However, even as I tried to return to my routine, something about the mansion on Salem Hill continued to disturb me. In the days that followed, I felt an unshakable unease, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me. At night, while trying to sleep, I would hear strange noises outside my house. No matter how much I checked the windows, I never saw anything. But the feeling of being watched was constant. One night, as I reviewed some of the photos I had taken at the mansion, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one of the pictures of the bedroom with the mirror, I spotted a vague silhouette reflected in the glass. It was indistinct, but resembled a tall, slender woman with what appeared to be a veil covering her face. The image was so subtle that at first I thought it was a lens defect or a strange reflection. But when I zoomed in, the details of the veil became clearer. Looking at that figure, something inside me screamed that it wasn't just a coincidence or a technical flaw. Something had followed me from that visit, and I needed answers. The next day, I decided to call Mr. Bellamy to ask more about the property. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail requesting a callback, but I never heard back from him. Something felt deeply wrong. Then I received a letter in my mailbox with no return address. The envelope, made of thick yellowed paper, was handwritten in an old-fashioned script. Inside was a brief message. You opened the door. Now you must close it. 42 Hillcrest Road awaits you. Chills ran through my body. Who had sent this? It was clear that the message referred to the mansion. Despite the growing fear within me, something told me the only way to end this was to go back to the house. That same night, armed with courage, a flashlight, and my old pocket knife, hardly a weapon, but it was all I had, I drove to the hill. The full moon cast a cold, silvery glow over the road. When I arrived at the property, I found the front door ajar. This isn't good, I muttered to myself. Entering the house, the metallic, heavy smell was even stronger. The air was colder, and an eerie vibration seemed to pulse from the walls. The house was exactly as I had left it, but it felt alive in a sinister way, as though it were expecting something. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom with the mirror. My instincts told me the key to everything was there. Entering the room, I noticed the mirror's reflection was brighter than the rest of the room, as if it had its own light. Approaching cautiously, I saw the figure in the mirror clearly. It was the woman from the photo, but this time she was staring directly at me. "Get out of here!" I yelled, gripping the flashlight tightly. The figure didn't move, but her lips began to part slowly, and I heard her voice, though there was no sound in the room. "You should not have come here." Suddenly, I felt the floor vibrate beneath my feet, and the mirror began to crack. An ear-splitting sound filled the room, a mix of screams and shattering glass. I turned to flee, but the door had slammed shut on its own. In the mirror's reflection, I saw not only the woman, but multiple figures emerging from the glass. They were tall, distorted shadows, as if pieces of darkness had taken form. The air grew heavier, and my vision began to dim. With the last bit of strength I had, I ran for the door, slamming my shoulder into it until it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway and down the stairs, nearly falling but not stopping until I was outside the house. As I sprinted toward my car, I heard one final scream erupt from inside the mansion, a mix of agony and rage. Back in the safety of my apartment, I did the only sensible thing. Handed the case off to another agent and stopped answering calls from Mr. Bellamy. A few weeks later, I received one final email from him. It read, "The house is satisfied. Don't worry anymore." I never fully understood what he meant by that, but I didn't need further explanation. Since that day, I've never returned to Salem Hill, and I don't want to know what happened there. I've learned my lesson. Some doors were never meant to be opened. I've been watching this channel for a few days now, and I've seen many stories here that have really moved me. So I decided to write mine and send it in. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced something similar, but to this day, this event haunts me and makes me question whether we're truly alone in this world. This happened a few years ago when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin deep in the dense forests of Maine. I've always loved outdoor adventures, and after months of stressful work, I thought a secluded retreat would be perfect to relax and recharge. The cabin belonged to an old acquaintance of my family and was about 30 miles from the nearest town, a perfect place to disconnect from the world. I arrived at dusk, and everything seemed peaceful. The place was small but cozy, with a single room serving as both the kitchen and living area, a tiny bathroom, and a bedroom with a wooden bed. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched for miles, seemingly endless. The only thing that concerned me was the fact that there was no cell signal. But at that moment, I thought it would only make the experience more immersive. I spent the first few hours exploring the surroundings and chopping wood for the fireplace. The silence of the forest was almost absolute, interrupted only by the wind rustling through the trees. When night fell, I lit the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner, listening to the crackling of the burning wood. That's when I noticed something strange. In the middle of my meal, I heard a noise coming from the forest, something like the snapping of breaking branches. I looked out the window, but all I could see was the darkness between the trees. I assumed it was just a deer or another wild animal passing by and went back to eating. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, the footsteps sounded closer. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the door. When I shined the light into the forest, the beam revealed only trees and more trees, no movement in sight. Even so, a chill ran down my spine. I went back inside and locked the door. I no longer felt as comfortable as I had before. The night went on, and the wind outside began to howl even louder. I lay in bed, trying to ignore my paranoia. But around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by another sound, the sound of scratching against the outer wall of the cabin. Terror gripped me. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The scratching continued for a few seconds and then stopped. But then, a new sound echoed through the room. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Someone was trying to get in. My body froze the moment I heard the knocks on the door. 3 slow, calculated taps. They weren't the impatient knocks of a lost traveler asking for help. They were cold, methodical, as if whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I held my breath and remained still in bed. The only light in the cabin came from the dying embers in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I tried to rationalize. It could just be a hunter, someone who had happened to see the cabin and wanted to take shelter from the cold. But what about the scratches on the wall and the footsteps I had heard before? My instincts screamed at me not to move. But then came the 4th knock, louder, more impatient. By now, my mind was in full panic mode. I knew I couldn't call the police since there was no cell service. The shotgun that used to be in the cabin, I remembered seeing it when I came here with my family years ago, wasn't in its usual place. The owner had probably taken it with him. All I had was a pocket knife in my backpack. Silence. Whoever was out there seemed to be waiting for a response. Slowly, I got up from the bed and tiptoed to the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. I grabbed the carving knife from the sink and held it tight, even though I knew that if it was someone dangerous, I wouldn't stand much of a chance. The wood on the porch creaked. My blood ran cold. The person, or thing, was moving around the cabin. Each step was careful, as if they were studying the place, looking for a weak spot. That's when I realized I had forgotten to lock the window next to the bed. My eyes widened. I turned to run and close it, but just as I took my first step, I heard a dull thud. the window sliding up a few inches. Adrenaline surged through my body. I sprinted toward the bedroom, but when I got there, the window was already open. The cold wind blew inside, rustling the curtain. And then I saw it. A hand, dirty, pale, with long skeletal fingers, gripping the window frame. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the chair in the corner of the room and threw it against the window with all my strength. The crash echoed through the cabin, and I heard a muffled scream from outside. Something moved quickly through the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I ran to lock the window, then grabbed my backpack and keys. I needed to get out of there. I rushed out the front door without looking back, sprinted to my car, and jumped inside, locking the doors. I started the engine, and the headlights illuminated the dirt road. Before speeding off, I took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw the shadow. At the edge of the forest, between the trees, a tall, thin figure was watching me. The glow of my headlights reflected in its eyes that didn't look human. I hit the gas without a second thought. I drove non-stop until I reached the main road, my chest still rising and falling uncontrollably. I never went back to that cabin. The owner of the property said no one lived nearby and that I must have imagined things. But even now, sometimes, late at night, I find myself remembering those knocks on the door and that pale hand at the window. And I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't acted so quickly. I never used to believe in ghosts. I always thought horror stories were exaggerated, born from imagination or collective fear. But after what happened that night inside the abandoned hospital in Vermont, my perception of what is real and what isn't changed forever. It was a Friday night when my friend Daniel suggested we explore the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, with dark stories about patients who suffered abuse and macabre experiments. Of course, most of these stories seemed like urban legends, but still, people avoided going near the building. I didn't want to go. Something told me it was a terrible idea, but Daniel insisted. He said it was just an old building and that it would be fun. In the end, I was convinced by two more friends, Jake and Oliver, and soon we were driving down the winding road leading to the hospital. The place was massive, an imposing structure with broken windows and rusted doors. The moonlight barely illuminated the dark corridors, and a cold wind whistled through the crumbling walls. As we stepped inside, the air smelled of mold and rust. The silence was almost absolute, except for the sound of our own footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. We walked with flashlights in hand, exploring different floors. We found old patient files, rusted gurneys, and even a restraint chair left in the corner of a room. The hospital was in ruins, but it still carried a heavy atmosphere, as if something had never truly left. That's when Oliver suggested we split up to cover more ground. Daniel and Jake went upstairs while Oliver and I stayed on the ground floor. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. As we walked down a narrow corridor, we noticed something strange. One of the doors, unlike the others that were open or falling apart, was completely shut. Oliver tried turning the handle, but it was locked. "How is this door still locked after all this time?" he asked. Before we could think about it further, we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. We looked at each other, confused. "Jake? Daniel?" I called out, but there was no response. The footsteps continued, heavy and slow. The sound of something being dragged echoed through the halls. Then we heard a scream from above. It was Daniel. Oliver and I ran up the stairs, our flashlights shaking in our hands. We found Jake in the corridor, pale, pointing toward one of the rooms. He's in there," Jake stammered. We entered the room and found Daniel leaning against the wall, gasping for breath. He pointed toward the corridor and said, his voice trembling, "There was someone there. I saw a woman." Oliver chuckled, trying to keep calm. "Come on, man, you must have imagined it." But Daniel insisted. "She was at the end of the hallway, wearing a white coat, but her face, it wasn't normal." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, as if the building itself was reacting to our conversation, we heard a loud creak coming from the corridor. Slowly we stepped out, our flashlights trembling as we pointed them toward the darkness ahead. And then we saw it. At the end of the corridor, a silhouette was moving slowly. The white coat, dirty and torn, was visible even in the dim light. But the worst part was when the flashlight beam illuminated its face. Or rather, the lack of one. Its face was just a void. No eyes, no mouth. Just a dark blur that seemed to shift and pulsate, as if the darkness itself was alive. The entity began moving toward us. We ran. Without looking back, we rushed down the stairs, sprinting toward the exit. The building seemed even darker and more claustrophobic. We could hear the footsteps behind us getting closer, accompanied by a horrible sound, a sharp hiss like someone trying to whisper our names. When we finally reached the exit, the door that had been wide open before was now nearly shut. I lunged and forced it open, feeling an icy shiver crawl up my spine. And then, in the last second before stepping outside, I felt something touch my shoulder. A hand. Cold, bony, but I didn't look back. We ran to the car, started the engine and sped away as fast as we could. No one spoke until we got back to town. The only thing Daniel said before we all went to our homes that night was, "She saw us." I didn't sleep that night, and the worst part? The next day we checked the photos we had taken in the hospital, and in one of them at the end of the corridor it was clearly visible, the silhouette, watching us. The next day no one wanted to talk about what had happened. We tried to go about our routines as if it had all been a trick of our imagination, but the problem was that we had all seen the same thing, and we had proof. That morning Jake sent a message in our group chat, "Look at the last photo we took at the hospital." I hesitated before opening it, already feeling a chill run down my spine. When I finally did, my stomach turned. At the end of the corridor, right where Daniel had said he saw the woman, there was a silhouette. It wasn't a blur or a trick of the light. It was a distinct figure wearing a torn white coat, and where a face should have been, there was only a dark void. No one replied for a few minutes until Oliver finally typed, "I want to forget this. Don't send anything else." I wanted to forget too, but it wouldn't leave me alone. I spent the entire night thinking about that cold hand I had felt on my shoulder before leaving the hospital. I could swear that wasn't just my imagination. In the days that followed, all of us seemed disturbed. Daniel was quieter than usual. Oliver started having nightmares, and Jake said he constantly felt like he was being watched. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but then the strange coincidences started. One night, I was home alone when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. My heart pounded. I got up to check, but there was nothing there. However, when I returned to my room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My flashlight, the same one I had used that night, was on, sitting on my desk. I was absolutely certain that I hadn't turned it on. I immediately called Daniel, and he picked up right away. Before I could even say anything, he asked, "Dude, did something weird just happen to you?" My heartbeat skyrocketed. "Why?" I asked. He took a deep breath before replying, "Because my door just opened by itself." That was enough to convince us that something was still haunting us. We decided we had to go back to the hospital, not to go inside, but to try and understand what we had disturbed. The next day, Daniel, Jake, and I drove back to the site. Oliver refused to come. When we arrived, we stood outside the hospital for a long time, just staring at the decaying structure. The place looked even more ominous than before. If something followed us, maybe we can return it, Jake said hesitantly. We had no idea what we were doing, but we stood at the entrance and threw the flashlight back inside the building. Then, each of us muttered something along the lines of, "We don't want you here anymore." Maybe it was just a silly ritual we made up on the spot. Maybe it was just for our own peace of mind. But after that, things went back to normal. The nightmares faded, the feeling of being watched disappeared, and we never experienced anything supernatural again. We never spoke about it again, and we never went back to the hospital. But even now, whenever I pass by that road, I feel a chill creep up my spine. And sometimes when I glance at the hospital's window, I swear I see a silhouette standing there, watching us. Lake Superior always felt strange to me. Ever since I was a kid, I heard stories about boats that vanished without a trace, fishermen who never returned, and shadows moving beneath the icy waters. But like anyone else, I thought they were just legends meant to scare tourists and younger residents. Until one day, I learned the hard way that some stories are real. It happened last summer. My name is Ryan, I'm 27, and I've always loved kayaking. I grew up paddling on Lake Superior with my father, and despite hearing the stories, I was never afraid of those waters. The lake is massive, larger than some seas, and the water, even in summer, is cold enough to freeze your bones. But I loved the solitude it provided. That afternoon, I was alone in my kayak exploring a more remote area of the lake. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Everything was silent except for the gentle sound of the small waves lapping against my kayak's hull. That's when I noticed something strange. The lake's surface was calm, but off in the distance I saw a small disturbance in the water, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. I stopped paddling and watched. It could have been a large fish, maybe a sturgeon or a pike. But then, the disturbance started moving, in a straight line, heading directly toward me. The first thought that crossed my mind was that it might be a floating log drifting with the current. But there wasn't a strong current there. And more importantly, it wasn't floating. It was moving fast, like it was swimming. My heartbeat picked up. I gripped my paddle and slowly started making my way back to the shore. I didn't want to seem scared, but something deep inside me screamed to get out of there as quickly as possible. And then I saw it. It emerged. Not much. Just enough to make my breath catch in my throat. A hand, a pale hand with long, thin fingers breaking the surface of the water for a brief moment before vanishing back into the depths. I let out a shout and started paddling frantically. My kayak rocked from side to side as I fought against the rising panic. I could feel the water moving behind me, something closing in fast. I didn't look back. All that mattered was reaching the shore. My hands trembled as I paddled as hard as I could. I could swear I felt something brushing against the hull of my kayak, a faint scratching against the fiberglass. And then, out of nowhere, everything went silent. The lake was calm again. My breathing was ragged, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I looked around, searching for any sign of that thing, but the water was smooth as glass. Only when I finally reached the shore and leapt from my kayak did I turn back, and that's when I saw it. In the middle of the lake, right where I had been just moments before, a silhouette stood. It was humanoid, but something was off. Its body seemed too thin, almost translucent against the reflection of the setting sun. I couldn't see its face, but I knew. It was looking at me. I stood frozen, watching, until the thing slowly sank, disappearing into the darkness of the lake. Since then, I've never gone back to Lake Superior. But sometimes, when I pass by the shore and glance at the water, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, waiting. Since that night on Lake Superior, my life has never been the same. I tried to forget what I saw, to convince myself that it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, an illusion caused by the setting sun's light and an irrational fear of deep waters. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the scratch on my kayak's hull. The next day, I went to the garage where I kept it and knelt down to inspect it. My hands trembled when I saw what was there. It wasn't just any scratch. It was long, thin marks, as if fingernails had scraped along the surface. They were deep, like something had tried to pull me under. After that, I decided to tell someone. My father had always been a skeptic, but he knew everything about the lake. When I told him my story, he just stared at me in silence, his eyes dark and distant. "You saw it then," he finally said. "What did I see?" I asked, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He sighed, took a cigarette, and gazed out the kitchen window toward the lake. "My grandfather used to talk about something like this when I was a kid," he said. "He claimed there was something in Lake Superior, something old. He called it the one who waits. Those words sent shivers through me. My father continued, "Back then, a lot of fishermen went missing. People thought they were just accidents, but there were strange reports. Marks on boats, bodies that were never found. My grandfather swore that on certain nights he saw something rise from the water and watch the boats, something that wasn't human." I swallowed hard. "And you? Do you believe that?" He took a long drag of his cigarette and looked at me. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think you shouldn't go back there." I wish I could say I followed his advice, that I was smart and never went near Lake Superior again. But something inside me couldn't let it go. Weeks passed, and every night I dreamed of the thing in the lake. I dreamed of the pale hand rising from the water, the silhouette on the surface, the invisible eyes watching me. And then I made the mistake of going back. This time I drove, parking near the shore with no intention of getting in the water. I just wanted to look, to find some rational explanation for what I had seen. The lake was calm, reflecting the stars like a black mirror, and then I saw it. There, in the middle of the lake, a head slowly emerged. My heart nearly stopped. The thing didn't move, just floated there like a forgotten corpse. But I knew it was alive. I knew it was watching me. I was frozen, unable to breathe. Then it started to move, toward me. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. The water around it began to ripple as if something massive was stirring beneath the surface. And that's when I saw it. More hands surfaced around it, as if they were pulling the creature up. Many hands. Too many to be human. That snapped me out of my trance. I ran back to my car, shaking, and sped away without looking back. I never returned to Lake Superior. I never spoke of that night again. But sometimes when I drive near the shore, I swear I see something in the water watching me, waiting. I was never the type to believe in urban legends. I always thought those stories were made up to scare kids or keep teenagers away from certain places. But that night, on a deserted road in New Hampshire, I learned the hard way that some legends might be real. It was late October, and I was driving home after meeting some friends in a nearby town. The night was cold, and a dense fog was spreading across the road, covering everything in a thick, opaque mist. Mine was the only car on the highway, and the only things illuminating the path were my headlights and the full moon peeking through the dry trees. And then I saw her. Standing on the shoulder of the road ahead was a woman. She wore a long white dress that swayed slightly with the cold wind. Her dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders. She didn't look lost, but she didn't seem to be waiting for anyone either. The road was surrounded by dense forest on both sides, with no houses or businesses nearby. Who would be standing there alone in the darkness? My first instinct was to ignore her and keep driving. But as I got closer, something inside me made me slow down. She didn't raise her hand to ask for a ride. She just stood there, staring at the road. I pulled over beside her and rolled down my window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman slowly turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, almost devoid of color. Her eyes were sunken and dark, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Can you take me?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Sure, get in." She opened the door and sat in the passenger seat. The moment she closed the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The car, which had been warm just seconds ago, suddenly felt freezing. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She stared straight ahead, not looking at me. "Just keep driving." I swallowed hard and kept my eyes on the road. The silence in the car was suffocating. I tried to observe her from the corner of my eye, but something about her filled me with deep unease. The dress looked old-fashioned, something out of another era, and her feet, they were bare, covered in dirt and leaves. "Do you live around here?" I asked. She turned her face toward me slowly, and for the first time, a real shiver ran through me. Her eyes had no light in them, as if there was no life behind them. "It doesn't matter," she replied. My heart started beating faster. Something was wrong. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand who she was, but something inside me screamed not to press further. I kept driving, each minute stretching into an eternity. The road felt longer than before, as if it would never end. Then, out of nowhere, she whispered, "We're almost there." "Almost where?" She pointed ahead. A sharp curve was coming up in the road. In the distance, an old guardrail was twisted and mangled, as if something had crashed there long ago. But what made me slam on the brakes was what I saw just beyond the curve. A wrecked car, rusted and covered in dead leaves, lay abandoned between the trees. My hands trembled as I realized something that made my blood run cold. The car was identical to mine. I turned to look at the woman beside me, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. A sickly scent of wilted flowers and damp earth filled the car. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. And then, before I could react, a breathy whisper brushed against my ear. "You should have kept driving." And at that moment, I knew. The legend of the woman in white wasn't just a story. My fingers were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. The car sat motionless in the middle of the road, headlights casting eerie beams onto the wreckage buried between the trees. Yet, despite being alone, I could still feel a presence inside the car. A lingering, invisible gaze watching me. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe that wrecked car only resembled mine, but wasn't actually the same. But deep down, I knew the truth. My breathing was heavy and uneven. I needed to leave. I turned the ignition again and reached for the gear shift. But the instant I touched it, the dashboard lights flickered. The radio, which had been off the entire drive, suddenly turned on. Static filled the cabin, followed by a weak, distorted voice. "You shouldn't have stopped." My heart nearly exploded in my chest. My hands trembled as I fumbled to turn off the radio, but the buttons wouldn't respond. The voice continued, breaking through the crackling interference. "You saw it." A chill crept down my spine. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting, dreading, to see something in the back seat. Nothing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, determined to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. But as I passed the twisted guardrail, I caught something in my peripheral vision. In the forest, between the trees, she was there. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking. She was just standing between the trunks, watching as my car sped by. Her vacant eyes gleamed unnaturally in the darkness, reflecting the glow of my headlights. I didn't look back. I just drove. The road seemed darker than before, the fog thicker, heavier. My thoughts spun wildly. Who was she? What happened to that wrecked car? I tried to recall the story. I had heard of the White Lady legend before. People said she was the spirit of a young woman who had died on this road years ago, killed in an accident when her car skidded off the curve. Locals believed her spirit wandered the highway, asking unsuspecting drivers for a ride, and those who stopped were never the same. After several miles of silent, desperate driving, I finally saw the glow of a small gas station up ahead. I pulled in and jumped out of the car, relieved to feel solid ground beneath my feet, bathed in warm fluorescent light. The attendant, an old man with a weathered face, eyed me as he wiped his hands on a dirty rag. "You all right, kid?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "You look like you just saw a ghost." I let out a nervous laugh, but said nothing. "You coming from up that way?" he asked, nodding toward the highway. I didn't answer, but my expression must have given everything away. His face darkened. He exhaled slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "You saw her, didn't you?" My throat went dry. The woman on the road?" The old man sighed and nodded. "You ain't the first. Some drivers pass right by, but the ones who stop, well, they say she gets in the car." I swallowed hard. "What happens to them?" I asked. The attendant looked down as if carefully choosing his words. "Some don't come back. But the ones who do, he hesitated. They say something changes. I shivered. Changes. How? He was silent for a moment. Then slowly, he pointed at the glass storefront next to us. I turned my head toward the reflection. There I was, my own reflection, just as I expected. But behind me, just over my shoulder, a white figure hovered. I spun around instantly, but there was nothing there, only the silence of the night. I left the gas station without another word. Since that night, I've never taken that road again. I've never spoken about what I saw. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I'm driving alone, I feel a sudden, chilling cold fill my car. And for just a moment, I get the terrifying sense that I'm not alone. It's been a few days since I've been trying to write this account, but every time I start, a shiver runs down my spine. Maybe it's the fear of reliving everything that happened, or maybe it's that strange feeling that by telling it, I might somehow bring it back into my life. My name is Ryan, and this happened to me last summer. I've always been fascinated by national parks, and Yellowstone was at the top of my list of places to explore. As an amateur photographer, my goal was to capture the wild beauty of the region, especially the less touristy areas. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon when the sky was tinged orange by the sunset. I chose a remote campsite near a little-used trail. The idea was to spend 3 days there, far from the chaos of the city and connected to nature. The first day was peaceful. I hiked a few trails, took incredible photos of the geysers and rock formations. At night, I set up a small campfire and admired the starry sky. Everything was perfect, until I noticed something strange. On the other side of the clearing near the trees, I saw a figure standing still. At first I thought it was just another camper, maybe a hunter. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the silhouette wasn't moving. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me. The discomfort started to build inside me. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident. No response, just the wind passing through the trees and the distant howl of a coyote. I decided to ignore it and went into my tent, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as if someone was out there, waiting. The next day, I got up early and decided to explore a more remote area of the park. I walked for hours, capturing amazing images of the untouched landscape. But the feeling of being watched never left me. And then, around noon, something happened that chilled my blood. While reviewing the photos on my camera, I noticed something strange in one of the images. In the corner of one of the photos I took that morning, there was a dark silhouette among the trees, the same stranger from the night before. My breathing grew heavy. He had been there the whole time, even when I thought I was alone. I looked around, feeling my heart race. The trees seemed closer together, the forest denser. Suddenly, I no longer felt safe. I decided to return to the campsite immediately. As I hurried along the trail, I heard small cracks among the trees, footsteps. But every time I stopped and looked back, I saw nothing. The way back seemed to take twice as long. When I finally arrived at the campsite, my tent was different. The zipper was open. My belongings were scattered. Someone had been there. Fear took hold of me. I grabbed my camera and started photographing the surroundings, hoping to capture anything strange. And that's when, upon checking the photos, I found the most terrifying image of all. A photo of my tent, taken from the middle of the trees. Someone had photographed me. Someone had been there the night before while I slept. The only thing I knew was that I had to get out of there before nightfall. But the worst was yet to come. My heart pounded. I held the camera with trembling hands as my eyes scanned the most terrifying image I had ever seen. Someone had photographed me. Someone had been there, hidden in the forest, watching. My first instinct was to grab my things and leave immediately. But something inside me told me I was no longer alone. The forest was too silent, as if all the animals had vanished. I needed to be quick. I threw the camera into my backpack and started dismantling my tent in a hurry, folding everything carelessly. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved between the trees. The same figure. Tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't see its face, only the dark silhouette contrasting against the fading afternoon light. And then it took a step forward. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. That's when the figure raised an arm and pointed at me. I didn't want to know what that meant. I grabbed my backpack, abandoned the tent, and ran. The forest blurred around me as my feet moved on their own. I didn't even look back. I didn't want to know if it was following me. I just wanted to get out of there. The way back to the road felt endless. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows among the trees stretched longer, making everything even more sinister. With every snapping branch, my heart jumped in my chest. Then, in the middle of the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones. They weren't mine. Someone had walked that path before me, and worse. They led back to my campsite, which meant whoever it was already knew I would flee that way. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by fast footsteps, like someone was running straight at me. I didn't think. I just ran faster. Adrenaline flooded my body, and I kept sprinting until I finally saw the road ahead. My car. I had never been so happy to see it. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. When I finally pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The trail was empty. Just the dark forest. But I knew. Someone was there, watching. I floored the gas pedal and got out of that place as fast as possible. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to a hotel. I locked the door to my room and checked the photos on my camera again. Now that I was safe, I tried to analyze the image of my tent, and that's when I saw something even worse. The photo didn't just show my tent. There was something else. In the background, among the trees, two eyes glowed in the darkness, and they were staring right at me. The next day, I reported everything to a park ranger. I showed him the photos, told him about the figure in the forest and how my tent had been ransacked. The man listened carefully, but in the end, he just shook his head. "Yellowstone is full of mysteries," he said. "But if I were you, I wouldn't go back to that campsite." He then told me that other campers had reported feeling watched in that area. Some claimed to have seen someone in the forest. Others heard whispers at night. But no one had ever figured out who or what it was, or if it was even human. I never went back to Yellowstone, and to this day, every time I see a photo of myself, I wonder, how many other times have I been photographed without realizing it?